When you see fresh dirt being thrown on top of such a small body, something inside you dies too. But before I tell you about that funeral, let me take you back to the moment that changed everything, the moment I almost lost my son forever. The bathroom door crashed open with a sound that still echoes in my nightmares. Steam rose from the tub like ghostly fingers, and there was Jack, my husband, the father of my child, holding our 18-month-old son Michael underwater. Michael's tiny arms flailed desperately. Bubbles escaped from his mouth as his green eyes, so much like his father's, bulged with terror. The water that should have been warm for his evening bath was ice cold. Jack's knuckles were white as he pressed down on our baby's chest. "Stop crying, you little brat!" Jack's voice was a snarl I barely recognized. "I'll teach you to shut up when I tell you to." Time slowed to a crawl. Every maternal instinct screamed at me to act. My body still aching from the beating Jack had given me an hour earlier for trying to pack our things and leave found strength I didn't know existed. I grabbed the ceramic soap dispenser from the counter and brought it down on Jack's head with every ounce of desperate love a mother possesses. He stumbled backward, releasing Michael. I plunged my hands into that freezing water and pulled my son to my chest. He was blue. He wasn't breathing. Breathe, baby, breathe," I whispered frantically, turning him over, patting his back. Water poured from his tiny mouth. Then thank God he gasped, coughed, and let out the most beautiful cry I'd ever heard. Jack recovered quickly, blood trickling from the cut on his temple. His eyes held a rage that was no longer human. "You crazy bitch, what have you done?" But then we heard them sirens wailing in the distance, getting closer. The phone call I'd managed to make to Mrs. Wilson, my former school principal, before Jack found me. Packing had worked. She'd called the police. Police opened the door. The banging on our front door was like thunder. Jack's face transformed from rage to panic in an instant. "What did you do, Betty? What did you do?" But it was too late. The door splintered open and 2 officers rushed in, weapons drawn. Behind them was Mrs. Wilson, her face etched with horror as she saw me bloodied, clutching my barely breathing son. "My God, Betty, what has he done to you?" That was the moment our old life ended and our long journey of survival began. Chapter 1, The Seeds of Love and Terror. But let me start from the beginning, because understanding how we got to that bathroom takes you back to Detroit in 1963, when I was just 17 and believed in fairy tales. I was Betty Margaret O'Connor, then the eldest of 5 children squeezed into a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Detroit. My father, God rest his soul, worked double shifts at the Ford plant. My mother took in sewing to make ends meet her nimble fingers, creating beautiful clothes for the wealthy ladies on the west side. "Betty girl, with a needle in your hand, you'll never go hungry," she'd say, teaching me intricate stitches by lamplight after dinner. She was right about the skill, but she couldn't have known how I'd need every survival technique she taught me. I was a dreamer with practical skills. While other girls my age were focused on boys and makeup, I was saving every penny from my job at Morrison's department store downtown. I had plans to finish high school, get my teaching certificate, and maybe travel beyond the city limits of Detroit. That's where I first saw Jack Brennan. He worked at the shoe store across the street, and Lord help me, he was the most handsome man I'd ever laid eyes on. Tall and lean with coal-black hair that caught the sunlight and those emerald eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. When he smiled, which he did often in those early days, it was like the whole world lit up. For weeks, we exchanged glances through store windows. He'd tip his hat when he saw me arranging the dress displays. I'd blush and pretend to be busy with customers. It was an innocent dance that made my 17-year-old heart race. Then came the day he walked into Morrison's. "Excuse me, miss, but I'm looking for a gift for my sister," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "Something special for her birthday." I knew it was a lie. I'd watched him for weeks and never seen him with any woman sister or otherwise. But I played along, showing him scarves and jewelry, my hands trembling slightly whenever his fingers brushed mine as I handed him items to examine. You have excellent taste, he said finally, purchasing a delicate silver bracelet that cost more than I made in a week. My sister will love it, though I have to confess I was really hoping to ask if you'd join me for coffee sometime. The honesty in his admission made me smile despite myself. I'd like that, I managed to say, though my mother's warnings about proper young ladies echoed in my head. Our first date was at Mel's Diner on Cass Avenue. Jack arrived with a single red rose and pulled out my chair like a perfect gentleman. He talked about his dreams of opening his own business, of making something of himself beyond the shoe store where he worked. I won't be selling other people's shoes forever, Betty. I've got plans, big plans. He spoke with such confidence, such certainty about his future. Our future, he began to say after a few weeks of courtship. It was intoxicating to a girl who'd never been farther than downtown Detroit. For 6 months, Jack was everything a young woman could want. He brought me flowers, walked me home from work, charmed my parents with his polite manners and ambitious talk. He'd sit in our tiny living room discussing politics with my father and complimenting my mother's cooking until she blushed like a schoolgirl. That young man has prospects, Betty, Dad said one night after Jack left. Respectful, hard-working. You could do worse. If only we could have seen what was lurking beneath that charming exterior. The first sign came in March of 1964. I was 20 minutes late meeting Jack because Mrs. Henderson, one of our regular customers, had needed help with a large order. When I finally arrived at our usual spot, Jack's face was thunderous. Where were you? His voice was cold, nothing like the warm tone I'd grown accustomed to. I'm sorry, there was a customer more important than me. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. I was worried something had happened to you. The grip loosened as quickly as it had tightened, and his expression shifted to one of concern. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I care about you so much. The thought of losing you makes me a little crazy. He was so apologetic, so loving, that I convinced myself it was romantic. He cared enough to worry. He loved me enough to be jealous of my time. Young and naive, I mistook possessiveness for passion. Over the next few months, the signs multiplied like storm clouds on the horizon. Jack began showing up at the store unannounced, ostensibly to take me to lunch, but really to see who I was talking to. He questioned me about customers, especially the male ones. That man seemed awfully interested in more than just buying a dress for his wife, he'd say after watching me help a perfectly innocent customer. He started making suggestions about my appearance, that my skirts were too short for a proper young lady, that my lipstick was too bold, that I smiled too much at strangers. I just want people to respect you the way I do, Betty. You're going to be my wife someday. That someday came sooner than expected. In December of 1964, Jack proposed with a small diamond ring he'd been saving for. Marry me, Betty. Let me take care of you forever. I said yes, of course. What 17-year-old girl wouldn't want to marry the handsome man who'd swept her off her feet? Looking back now, I realized that marriage proposal wasn't a question, it was a trap disguised as a dream come true. We married on June 12, 1965, in a simple ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral. I wore my mother's altered wedding dress, and Jack looked devastatingly handsome in a black suit he'd bought especially for the occasion. The reception was held in my parents' backyard, with folding tables borrowed from the church, and my mother's famous potato salad. Everyone said we looked like the perfect couple, young, beautiful, full of hope and love, if they only knew what was to come. We moved into a small apartment on the north side of town. It was tiny but bright with windows that caught the morning sun. I spent hours making it perfect, sewing curtains, arranging furniture, creating the cozy home I'd always dreamed of. For the first few months, marriage was everything I'd hoped. Jack would come home from work and sweep me into his arms, spinning me around the kitchen while I laughed. We'd sit together in the evenings, making plans for our future, talking about the children we'd have and the house we'd buy. 2 boys and a girl. Jack would say, his hand resting on my still flat stomach. Our little family. But gradually, so slowly, I barely noticed at first, things began to change. It started with money. Jack suggested we combine our finances completely. We're a team now, Betty. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. It's more efficient this way. It made sense, so I agreed. I didn't realize until later that ours really meant his. Jack began questioning every purchase I made, even necessities like groceries and fabric for mending clothes. $3 for bread and milk. Didn't we just buy groceries yesterday? Do you really need new stockings? Those look fine to me. Next came the suggestions about my work at Morrison's. You look so tired when you come home, sweetheart. And that long commute in the winter? Maybe it's time you considered staying home. I make enough to support us. I loved my job. I loved the customers, the responsibility, the sense of independence it gave me. But Jack was persistent, and his arguments seemed reasonable. Why should I struggle with buses and difficult customers when he could provide for us? Against my better judgment, I gave my notice in January of 1966. That was when the isolation truly began. Without work to occupy my days, I spent more time at home. Jack began calling frequently to check on me. Just wanted to hear your voice, beautiful. What are you doing? At first, it seemed sweet. But the calls became more frequent, more detailed in their questioning. Where had I been? Who had I talked to? Why had it taken me so long to answer the phone? Visits to my family became less frequent. There was always a reason Jack couldn't come along. He was tired, he had work to catch up on. He felt unwelcome because of something my father had said. Your mother is always giving advice about our marriage, Betty. It's like she doesn't think I can take care of my own wife. Eventually, it was easier to skip the visits altogether than to deal with Jack's sulking afterward. The first time he hit me was in March of 1966. I'd been to the grocery store and stopped by my mother's house on the way home, staying longer than planned because she wasn't feeling well. When I got home, Jack was waiting in the kitchen, his face dark with anger. Where the hell have you been? At Mother's. She had a headache and The slap came so fast, I didn't see it coming. The sting of his palm against my cheek was nothing compared to the shock of what had just happened. Don't lie to me, Betty. The grocery store closes at 5. It's nearly 7. For a moment, we both stared at each other in stunned silence. Then Jack's expression crumpled. Oh, God, Betty, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean... I was just so worried about you. I thought something terrible had happened. He pulled me into his arms, and I could feel him trembling. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. The thought of losing you makes me crazy. I would never hurt you on purpose. You know that, right? I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So I nodded and let him hold me while he whispered apologies into my hair. That night, he was tender and loving, bringing me ice for my cheek and promising it would never happen again. And for a few weeks it didn't. But the precedent had been set. Chapter 2. New Life. New Nightmare. I discovered I was pregnant in May of 1966. The news should have been joyous. We'd been trying for a baby since our wedding night. But by then, I was already walking on eggshells around Jack, never knowing what might set off his temper. When I told him, his reaction was everything I'd hoped for. He picked me up and spun me around, laughing with pure joy. A baby! We're going to have a baby! For the next few months, Jack was the man I'd fallen in love with. He was attentive, protective, excited about becoming a father. He talked to my growing belly every night, telling our unborn child about all the things they do together. Daddy's going to teach you to throw a baseball, little one. We'll go fishing at the lake and camping in the woods. I let myself believe that the baby would fix everything, that fatherhood would bring out the best in Jack permanently. How naive I was. Michael Jack Brennan was born on January 15, 1967, after 18 hours of difficult labor. The moment they placed him in my arms, I felt a love more powerful than anything I'd ever experienced. He was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, those distinctive Brennan green eyes, and a cry that could wake the dead. Jack seemed as smitten as I was those first few weeks. He'd hold Michael for hours, just staring at his tiny face in wonder. Look at him, Betty. He's going to be strong like his daddy. But as the reality of life with a newborn set in Jack's patience began to fray. Michael was a colicky baby crying for hours despite my best efforts to comfort him. I walked the floors night after night, bouncing him, singing to him, trying everything the doctor suggested. Jack, who needed his sleep for work, grew increasingly irritated. "Can't you keep him quiet? I have to be up in 4 hours." "I'm trying, Jack. The doctor says some babies just cry more." Other women manage to keep their babies calm. "What's wrong with you?" The criticism cut deep. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperately trying to be the perfect mother and wife Jack expected. But nothing I did seemed good enough. When Michael was 3 months old, Jack complained that I was neglecting him. "You used to greet me at the door when I came home from work. Now you barely look up from that baby." "Jack, he's just a baby. He needs—" "What about what I need? I work all day to support this family, and I come home to a wife who acts like I don't exist." That night, despite my protests that I was still recovering from childbirth, still breastfeeding, still exhausted beyond belief, Jack demanded his husband's rights. It was the first time I truly understood that in his mind, I was his property, not his partner. The first time Jack hit Michael, our son was 6 months old. He was teething and crying more than usual. I was trying to prepare dinner while soothing him, bouncing him on my hip as I stirred a pot of soup. Jack came home from a particularly bad day at work. He'd been passed over for a promotion he'd been counting on. The sound of Michael's crying greeted him at the door. "Jesus Christ, doesn't that kid ever shut up?" "He's teething, Jack. I know it's loud, but—" Jack crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and backhanded Michael across his chubby cheek. The baby's cry of pain was so sharp, so shocked, that it seemed to echo off the walls. "There, now he has something real to cry about." I was so stunned I couldn't speak for a moment. Michael's cheek was bright red, and his cries had taken on a note of genuine terror. "Jack, he's just a baby. He doesn't understand." "He'll learn. They all learn." That night, I held Michael close and wept silently into his soft hair. The handprint on his tiny face had faded, but the mark on my soul was permanent. I knew then that I had to find a way to protect my child, but I had no idea how. Over the following months, Jack's violence toward Michael escalated. A slap for crying during his favorite TV show, a shake for spitting up on his shirt, a squeeze of tiny arms when Michael reached for me instead of him. "He doesn't respect me," Jack would say. "A boy needs to respect his father from the beginning, or he'll never learn." By Michael's first birthday, my once happy baby had become withdrawn and fearful. He would tense up when he heard Jack's key in the lock would cry when his father tried to hold him. It broke my heart to see my child learn to fear the man who should have been his protector. I began to plan our escape. It wasn't easy. Jack controlled all our money, monitored my comings and goings, and had successfully isolated me from friends and family. But I was desperate. I started hiding small amounts of change from grocery shopping, tucking quarters and dimes into a coffee can I kept hidden behind the flour in the kitchen cabinet. I also began reaching out carefully to my old life. During Michael's naps, I would sometimes call Mrs. Wilson, my former principal at the elementary school where I'd briefly taught before marriage. "Betty dear, how are you? We miss you here at the school." I'm fine, Mrs. Wilson. How is everyone?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth over the phone, but I think she sensed something in my voice. "You know, Betty, if you ever need anything at all, you can call me, day or night. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am, thank you." I clung to that lifeline, even as I hoped I'd never need to use it. The day I tried to leave was the day that changed everything forever. It was a Tuesday in November of 1968. Michael was almost 2 years old, walking but still unsteady on his feet. Jack had been particularly volatile lately. He'd been drinking more, staying out later, coming home angry about his job, his life, everything. The night before, he'd grabbed Michael roughly when the toddler had accidentally knocked over a glass of water while trying to reach for a toy. Michael had cried, and Jack had shaken him so hard I was afraid his little neck would snap. "Stop it!" I'd screamed, grabbing Jack's arm. "You're hurting him!" Jack had turned on me then, his fist connecting with my ribs so hard I saw stars. I'd spent the night curled around Michael in our bed, both of us trembling, while Jack snored off his drunk in the living room. The next morning, I made my decision. While Jack was at work, I packed a small bag with essentials, diapers, formula change of clothes for Michael and me, and the small amount of money I'd managed to save. My plan was simple: take the bus to my mother's house and figure out what to do from there. But Jack came home early that day. I was in the bedroom trying to coax Michael into his coat when I heard the front door slam. My blood turned to ice. "Betty, where are you?" His voice was already angry. I quickly shoved the bag under the bed and picked up Michael, trying to compose myself. "In here, Jack. Just changing Michael's diaper." But Jack's eyes were sharp, taking in details I'd missed: Michael's coat still on my purse by the door, the slight disarray of hastily packed belongings. "Going somewhere?" His voice was dangerously quiet. I thought I'd take Michael for a walk. The weather's nice and..." He crossed to the bed and pulled out the bag I'd hidden there. For a moment, we both stared at it in silence. "You were leaving." It wasn't a question. "Jack, please let me explain. You were going to take my son away from me." The beating that followed was the worst yet. Jack hit me with his fists. His open hands kicked me when I fell to the floor. Through it all, Michael screamed from the corner where I'd pushed him to keep him safe. When Jack finally stopped, I was barely conscious. Blood filled my mouth and pain radiated through my entire body. "Nobody takes my son from me," Jack panted, standing over me. "Nobody. You try that again and I'll kill you both. Do you understand me?" I nodded weakly, tasting copper and fear. "Good. Now clean yourself up and stop filling the boy's head with poison against his father." Jack left the room and I heard him go into the bathroom, starting the water for Michael's bath. It was part of his routine when he came home bathing. Michael was one of the few times he seemed to take genuine pleasure in fatherhood. I struggled to my feet, every movement agony. Michael was still crying, reaching for me with his little arms. I gathered him close, whispering reassurances I didn't believe myself. Then I heard Jack's voice from the bathroom, and it was different. Darker. More dangerous than I'd ever heard it. "Come on, boy. Daddy's going to give you a bath, a nice cold bath to cool you down." Something in his tone made my blood freeze. I set Michael down and crept toward the bathroom, my heart pounding so hard I was sure Jack would hear it. What I saw through the crack in the door will haunt me until my dying day. Jack was filling the tub with cold water, not cool, but genuinely cold. His face was twisted with rage, and he was muttering to himself, "Little brat thinks he can come between me and my wife. Time to learn some respect." Michael, sensing something wrong, began to cry again. And Jack grabbed my baby and plunged him into that freezing water. What happened next brought us back to where this story began, me bursting through that bathroom door, to find Jack holding my son underwater, Michael's little life slipping away in his father's hands. Chapter 3. Rescue and Recovery. The sirens that had seemed so distant grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside our apartment building. The sound of boots on stairs, voices shouting commands. "Police, open up." Jack looked at the bathroom door, then at me, holding Michael, who was still coughing up water and crying weakly. For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Was it remorse, fear, or just anger at being caught? "This is your fault," he said quietly. "If you hadn't tried to leave, none of this would have happened." The front door splintered open with a crash that seemed to shake the whole building. Heavy footsteps thundered through our little apartment, and then 2 police officers appeared in the bathroom doorway, guns drawn. "Step away from them," the older officer commanded. "Hands where we can see them." Jack raised his hands slowly, water dripping from his sleeves. Behind the officers, I saw Mrs. Wilson's familiar face, her eyes wide with horror as she took in the scene, me bloodied and beaten, clutching my blue-lipped baby water everywhere. "That dear God in heaven," she whispered. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Paramedics arrived, gently taking Michael from my arms to check his breathing and heart rate. More police officers came, photographing the scene, asking questions I could barely answer through my swollen lips. Jack was handcuffed and led away, but not before he turned to look at me one last time. "This isn't over, Betty. He's my son too." The words chilled me more than the cold water still soaking my clothes. At the hospital, they separated Michael and me, him to the pediatric intensive care unit, me to the emergency room, where doctors counted my injuries like items on a grocery list. 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, extensive bruising, a split lip that would need stitches. But all I cared about was Michael. My baby, I kept saying to anyone who would listen. Please, I need to see my baby. Dr. Martinez, the pediatrician who'd taken charge of Michael's care, was a kind woman about my mother's age. She sat beside my hospital bed with a gentleness that made me want to cry. Mrs. Brennan, your son is stable, but I won't lie to you, it was very close. When children are deprived of oxygen, even for a short time, there can be complications. What kind of complications? We won't know the full extent for several days, maybe weeks. But there could be developmental delays, learning difficulties, behavioral issues. The brain is remarkably resilient in children, especially ones as young as Michael, but she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Mrs. Wilson stayed with me through those first terrible hours. She held my hand while doctors stitched my lip, brought me clean clothes when mine were taken as evidence, and made phone calls I was too overwhelmed to make myself. I called your mother, she said gently. She's on her way. When my mother arrived, she took one look at my face and burst into tears. But they weren't tears of pity. They were tears of rage. That monster, she said, her voice shaking. I should have seen it. I should have protected you. Mom, you couldn't have known. A mother knows. Deep down, a mother always knows when something isn't right. I failed you, Betty. I failed my grandson. We held each other and cried for everything we'd lost, everything that could never be undone. The police came to take my statement while I was still in the hospital. Detective James Riley was a large man with gentle eyes who spoke softly and never made me feel rushed or judged. Mrs. Brennan, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. So, I did. I told him about the gradual changes in Jack's behavior, the isolation, the financial control, the escalating violence. I told him about the hits and the threats, about my attempts to protect Michael, about the failed escape and Jack's rage. And I told him about finding my husband trying to drown our baby in a bathtub full of cold water. Detective Riley took notes throughout my story, his expression growing darker with each detail. Mrs. Brennan, what you've described is a clear pattern of domestic abuse escalating to attempted murder. With your testimony and the medical evidence, we have a strong case. What happens now? Your husband is being held without bail on charges of attempted murder, assault, and battery and child endangerment. If convicted, he could face 25 years to life. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by fear. What if he gets out? What if he comes back? We'll help you get a restraining order. And Mrs. Brennan, Detective Riley's voice was firm. You did the right thing. You saved your son's life. Michael spent 2 weeks in the hospital. For the first few days, he was in intensive care connected to machines that monitored his breathing and heart rate. I stayed by his bedside, constantly talking to him, singing the lullabies I'd sung when he was a newborn, willing him to be okay. Gradually, he began to respond. His breathing improved. His color returned to normal, and most importantly, he started to smile when he saw me. But the doctor's concerns proved well-founded. Dr. Martinez called me into her office after a week of tests and observations. Michael has definitely suffered some neurological effects from the oxygen deprivation. We're seeing delays in his motor responses and some regression in his speech development. Will he be okay? Children are remarkable, Mrs. Brennan. With proper therapy and support, many children with similar injuries go on to live full, happy lives. But it will require dedication, physical therapy, speech therapy, possibly special education services as he gets older. I didn't care. Michael was alive. Everything else we could figure out. The day we were discharged from the hospital, Mrs. Wilson was waiting for us with her car. You're both coming home with me? She said in a tone that brooked no argument. I have plenty of room, and you need time to figure out what comes next. Mrs. Wilson, I can't impose. Betty, dear, you're not imposing. You're accepting help from someone who cares about you. There's a difference. Mrs. Wilson's house was a sanctuary. It was a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood with a big backyard and a spare bedroom that she quickly converted into a nursery for Michael. She helped me enroll him in early intervention programs, drove us to therapy appointments, and never once made me feel like a burden. Every child deserves a chance to thrive, she would say when I thanked her for the 100th time. And every mother deserves support in helping them get there. Living with Mrs. Wilson also gave me the stability I needed to face the legal proceedings against Jack. His trial began 6 months later, and I had to testify about everything he'd done to us. Sitting in that courtroom facing the man who'd nearly killed my son was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Jack's lawyer tried to paint me as an unstable, vindictive wife who was exaggerating the abuse to get revenge after a marital spat. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Brennan, that you and your husband had a history of loud arguments?" He screamed at me. Yes. I rarely raised my voice. "And isn't it true that you were planning to leave him taking his son away?" I was planning to protect my child from further abuse. "But you never called the police before this incident. Did you never sought help from authorities?" "I was afraid. He threatened to kill us both if I ever tried to leave." The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Linda Chen, was excellent at presenting the medical evidence. She showed photographs of my injuries, Michael's medical records expert testimony about the effects of near drowning on children. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said in her closing argument, "the evidence is clear. Jack Brennan systematically abused his wife and child, culminating in an attempt to murder his own son. This was not a moment of anger or poor judgment. This was deliberate, calculated violence against the most vulnerable members of his family." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Jack was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. It wasn't the 25 years to life Detective Riley had hoped for, but it was enough to give Michael and me time to rebuild our lives. Or so I thought. I had no idea that 15 years would pass like a blink of an eye, and that Jack's rage would only grow stronger in prison. Chapter 4. Building a New Life. The first year after the trial was the hardest and the most hopeful time of my life. Hard because Michael required constant care and therapy, because I was learning to navigate life as a single mother with no income and limited job skills. Hopeful because every small improvement in Michael's condition felt like a miracle. Mrs. Wilson helped me get a job as a teacher's aide at the elementary school where she was principal. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover our basic expenses, even with the subsidized childcare the school provided. But it was a start, and it allowed me to be near Michael during the day. Michael's progress was slow but steady. At 2.5, he was finally walking confidently, though he still had balance issues. His speech was limited to simple words and phrases, but Dr. Martinez was encouraged by his improvement. "He's beating the odds, Mrs. Brennan. His brain is rewiring itself, finding new pathways. Keep doing what you're doing." What I was doing was spending every free moment working with him. Physical therapy exercises in the evening, speech drills during dinner, reading to him every night before bed. Mrs. Wilson would often find us on the living room floor, Michael struggling to stack blocks or trying to repeat the words I was patiently modeling. "You're a remarkable mother, Betty," she told me one evening as we watched Michael carefully place one block on top of another, a skill that had taken months to master. "I'm just doing what any mother would do." "No, dear. You're doing what every mother should do, but not every mother has the strength to do. There's a difference." As Michael turned 3, then 4, then 5, we settled into a routine that felt almost normal. I was promoted to a full teaching position specializing in special education. Michael's challenges had given me insights that made me better at helping other struggling children. Michael started regular kindergarten with an aide, a milestone I'd once thought impossible. He was still behind his peers in many ways, but he was curious, affectionate, and determined. His laugh, when it came, could light up any room. We moved into our own small apartment when Michael was 6. It was tiny, just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen barely big enough for a table. But it was ours, the first place that had belonged to just Michael and me. "This is our home, sweetheart," I told him as we unpacked our few belongings. "Just yours and mine." He nodded solemnly, understanding in his own way that this was important. "Safe home, Mama." "Yes, baby, safe home." For several years, it felt like we were finally free. Michael thrived in elementary school, making friends and excelling in art and music, despite his ongoing academic struggles. I found fulfillment in my work and even began to think about dating again, though I wasn't sure I'd ever trust another man enough to let him into our carefully constructed world. The reminder that Jack was still out there came when Michael was 11 and had been doing so well that his special education services were reduced to just a few hours a week. I got a call at school from Detective Riley, now promoted to sergeant. "Mrs. Brennan, I wanted to let you know that Jack's parole hearing is coming up. He served 8 years of his sentence, and with good behavior, he might be released early." The world seemed to tilt. 8 years had passed so quickly, filled with Michael's therapies and achievements, my work, our quiet life. I'd almost forgotten that Jack's imprisonment wasn't permanent. What does that mean for us?" "The restraining order is still in effect, and his parole conditions will likely include staying away from you and Michael. But Mrs. Brennan, I have to be honest, these orders are only as good as the man's willingness to follow them." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Michael's peaceful breathing from the next room. He was finally happy, finally healthy, in all the ways that mattered. The idea of Jack returning to disrupt that peace was unbearable. I started making plans just in case. I researched other cities, other school districts where my teaching credentials would transfer. I quietly saved money this time, not hiding it from an abusive husband, but preparing for the possibility that we might need to disappear entirely. Most importantly, I had a conversation with Mrs. Wilson that I'd been dreading. "If something happens to me," I said one afternoon in her office, "if Jack gets out and if anything happens, will you help Michael?" She looked at me sharply. "Betty, you're scaring me. What are you planning?" "Nothing specific. I just need to know that Michael will be safe no matter what." Mrs. Wilson reached across her desk and took my hands. "That boy is like a grandson to me. Of course I'll help him. But Betty, if you're in danger, you need to tell someone. Don't try to handle this alone." "I won't, I promise." It was a promise I fully intended to keep, but fate had other plans. Jack was released on parole in February of 1981 after serving 9 years of his sentence. I got the call on a Tuesday morning while I was teaching a reading group of second graders. "Mrs. Brennan. This is Sergeant Riley. Jack Brennan was released yesterday morning. His parole officer will be monitoring him closely, and he's required to stay in a halfway house on the other side of the city." "Other side of the city isn't far enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady so my students wouldn't be alarmed. "I understand your concern. We've increased patrols in your neighborhood, and I want you to have my direct number. Any sign of him, anything that makes you uncomfortable, you call immediately." That afternoon, I sat Michael down for a conversation I'd hoped we'd never need to have. "Michael, do you remember the stories I've told you about your father?" He nodded. I'd been age-appropriately honest about Jack, that his father had hurt us both when Michael was very young, that he'd gone away as punishment, and that we were safer without him. "Well, he's not in jail anymore. He's not allowed to come near us, but I need you to be extra careful for a while. Don't go anywhere alone, don't talk to strangers, and if you ever see a man who looks like those pictures I showed you, you run away and find a safe adult immediately." Michael, now 14 and much more aware of the world around him, despite his developmental delays, understood the seriousness of the situation. "Is he going to hurt us again, Mama?" "Not if I can help it, sweetheart. But we need to be smart and careful." For 3 months, we lived in a state of heightened alertness. I walked Michael to and from school instead of letting him take the bus. We varied our routes and schedules. I installed additional locks on our apartment door and taught Michael how to call 911. Then, on a warm May evening, our careful preparations proved inadequate. I was grading papers at the kitchen table while Michael did homework in the living room. It was just past 7 o'clock, still light outside, the kind of peaceful spring evening that made you forget the world could be dangerous. The knock on the door was soft, almost polite. I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize, medium height, brown hair, wearing a maintenance uniform. "Maintenance," he called. "We've had reports of a water leak in this unit. Need to check your pipes." I almost opened the door. It seemed reasonable we had been having issues with the bathroom faucet, but something made me hesitate. "I wasn't notified about any maintenance. Can you come back tomorrow when the office is open?" "Ma'am, this is an emergency. If we don't fix this tonight, you could have flooding by morning." His voice was more insistent now, and something about it made my skin crawl. I quietly moved away from the door and went to the living room window that overlooked the parking lot. There was no maintenance van. But there was a car I didn't recognize, and leaning against it, smoking a cigarette, was a man who made my blood freeze. Jack had gained weight and gone gray at the temples, but those green eyes were unmistakable. He was watching our apartment window, waiting. The man at the door wasn't maintenance. He was working with Jack. I grabbed Michael's hand and pulled him toward the bedroom, whispering urgently, "We have to go, right now, out the window." Mama, what's wrong?" "Your father found us." Michael's face went white, but he didn't argue. We'd practiced this scenario, though I'd prayed we'd never need to use it. Our apartment was on the second floor, but there was a fire escape outside the bedroom window. I threw some clothes and money into a bag while Michael climbed out onto the metal platform. Behind us, the knocking on the front door had become pounding. "Open up, we know you're in there." We made it down the fire escape and into the alley behind our building, just as I heard the front door being forced open. In the distance, I could hear Jack's voice louder now, angrier. "Where are they? Search every room?" We ran. That was the beginning of our life on the run. A life of false names, constant fear, and the terrible knowledge that no matter how far we went, Jack would keep looking for us. Chapter 5. New Identities, Old Fears. We ran through back alleys and side streets, Michael keeping pace despite his coordination issues driven by pure adrenaline. I'd memorized the bus routes months ago as part of our emergency planning, and we made it to the Greyhound station just as the 9:15 to Chicago was boarding. 2 tickets to Chicago. I told the clerk, paying in cash and trying not to look over my shoulder. We sat in the back of the bus, Michael curled against my side, both of us watching through the rear window until Detroit's lights disappeared behind us. "Where are we going, Mama?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart. Somewhere safe?" But I was beginning to realize that safe might not exist as long as Jack was free. In Chicago, I called Mrs. Wilson from a payphone outside the bus station. "Betty, thank God. The police found your apartment ransacked. They're looking for you." "We're okay, but Mrs. Wilson, I need help. Not just regular help. I need to disappear." There was a long pause. "I understand, dear. I have a friend who works with women in situations like yours. Women who need to start completely over. Can you stay somewhere safe for a few days while I make some calls?" We spent 3 days in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Chicago, living on vending machine food and takeout, watching children's shows on a fuzzy television, while I tried to figure out what to do next. Mrs. Wilson called back with an address in Seattle and a name, Margaret Thompson. "She's my sister-in-law," Mrs. Wilson explained. "She runs a private school there and has helped other women disappear from dangerous situations. She's expecting you." "What about you if Jack figures out you helped us?" "Let me worry about that. You just focus on keeping that boy safe." 2 days later, Betty and Michael Brennan died in a car accident outside Toledo, Ohio. At least that's what the falsified documents suggested. Laura and Peter Johnson were born on a rainy afternoon in Seattle, Washington. Margaret Thompson was a woman who understood the art of disappearing. Thin and sharp-eyed with prematurely gray hair and hands that moved constantly, she met us at her front door with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "You must be Laura," she said, not missing a beat with the name change. "And this handsome young man must be Peter." Michael looked at me uncertainly, but I squeezed his hand. "Yes, this is Peter. Say hello, sweetheart." Over the next several weeks, Margaret helped us construct our new lives with meticulous detail. She provided social security numbers, birth certificates, school records for Michael Peter that showed he'd been born in Portland and educated there until we moved to Seattle after my husband's fictional death in a car accident. "The key to a good false identity," she explained as we went over our new history for the 100th time, "is keeping the lies as close to the truth as possible. Peter really was born when Michael was born, just not where. You really are a teacher, just not under this name. The more truth you can incorporate, the less likely you are to slip up." I got a job at Margaret's school, Evergreen Academy, teaching 3rd grade. Peter enrolled in their special education program where his learning differences were seen as challenges to overcome rather than disabilities to accommodate. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe we might actually be safe. Seattle in the early 1980s was a city in transition full of people from somewhere else, all trying to reinvent themselves. We fit right in. I rented a small apartment in the Fremont neighborhood close enough to the school for us to walk on nice days. Peter thrived in ways I hadn't expected. Maybe it was the change of scenery, or maybe it was the relief of being truly free from Jack's shadow. But his academic performance improved dramatically. His speech became clearer, his coordination better. He made friends, real friends, for the first time in his life. "Mom, can Tommy come over after school?" he asked one afternoon, using the shortened version of Mama. That seemed more age-appropriate for a teenager. "Of course, sweetheart." Watching Peter play video games with Tommy Chen, their laughter filling our little apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope for a normal future. The years passed quietly. Peter graduated from high school, not with honors, but he graduated. He got a job at a local print shop, discovered he had a talent for graphic design, and started taking community college classes in art. I taught school, attended PTA meetings, even went on a few dates with men who had no idea that Laura Johnson was a fabrication. The relationship never went anywhere serious. I was too afraid of someone discovering the truth, but they gave me a glimpse of what life might have been like if I'd never met Jack Brennan. By 1990, when Peter was 23 and had been living as himself for 9 years, I almost believed our new identities were real. Betty and Michael Brennan seemed like characters from a book I'd read long ago, not people we had actually been. That's when Mrs. Wilson's letter arrived. I recognized her handwriting immediately, though the return address was unfamiliar. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. "My dear Laura, I hope this letter finds you and Peter well and happy. I'm writing to tell you that a certain person from your past will no longer be able to cause you trouble. He was killed in a car accident 3 months ago while driving under the influence. The authorities confirmed his identity, and there is no question about the outcome. You are truly free now. I thought you deserved to know. All my love, E.W." I read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Jack was dead. Really, truly dead. I sat down heavily on our couch and wept not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it felt like drowning in reverse, like finally surfacing after years underwater. When Peter came home from work that evening, he found me still sitting there, holding the letter. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. Everything's right. Your father is dead." Peter's face went through a complex series of emotions: surprise, relief, confusion, and something that might have been grief for the father he'd never really had. "Are we safe now? Really safe?" "Yes, baby, we're really safe." That night, we ordered pizza and watched old movies on television, talking about the future in ways we'd never dared before. Peter mentioned a girl at work he'd been too afraid to ask out. I talked about maybe taking some graduate courses advancing my career. For the first time in over a decade, we made plans that extended beyond mere survival. But our peace was not destined to last. 3 years later, in the spring of 1993, a knock came at our door that would shatter our carefully constructed world once again. Chapter 6. The Brothers Return. The man at our door looked nothing like Jack, which is probably why I opened it without thinking. He was shorter, stockier, with brown hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a neat business suit and carried a briefcase looking for all the world like an insurance salesman or financial advisor. "Mrs. Johnson?" he asked politely. "Yes. My name is Richard Nelson. I'm an attorney from Detroit. I believe you may have known my client's late brother, Jack Brennan." The blood drained from my face so quickly I had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. I'm sorry I don't know anyone by that name." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you do, Mrs. Brennan. Or should I say, Mrs. Johnson. My client has been looking for you and his nephew for quite some time." I tried to close the door, but Richard's foot was already in the doorway. Now, there's no need for alarm. My client simply wants to meet his nephew and discuss some family matters. There's been an inheritance, you see." "I don't want anything from Jack's family. Please leave." "Mrs. Brennan, excuse me, Mrs. Johnson, you misunderstand. This isn't optional. My client has legal rights here." The politeness was fading from his voice, and I could see something harder underneath. What legal rights? Jack signed away his parental rights before he died. Actually, he didn't. And there's the matter of the inheritance. Michael's sorry Peter is entitled to his father's estate. Peter appeared behind me home from his job at the print shop. At 26, he was taller than I was now, with the same green eyes as his father, but a gentleness that Jack had never possessed. "Mom, who is this?" Richard's eyes lit up when he saw Peter. "You must be Michael. You look just like your father did at your age." Peter stepped closer to me, his instincts telling him something was wrong, even if he didn't understand what. "My name is Peter, and I don't have a father." "Oh, but you do. And you have an uncle who's very eager to meet you. My client has been searching for his family for years." I found my voice. "We don't want to meet anyone from Jack's family. Please leave, or I'll call the police." Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "Before you do that, you might want to look at these." He handed me a stack of photographs, and my world tilted on its axis. They were pictures of us. Peter walking to work. Me shopping at the grocery store. Us eating dinner at the little Italian restaurant we went to every Friday night. Recent pictures taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. "My client is a patient man, Mrs. Brennan. He's been watching, learning your routines, understanding your life here. He doesn't want to disrupt your peace. He just wants to be part of the family." The threat was clear, even wrapped in polite language. "What does he want?" "Just a meeting. Tomorrow evening. There's a little farmhouse about an hour outside the city, very private, very discreet. You'll come, you'll talk, you'll learn about your inheritance, and then you can decide what kind of relationship you want going forward." He handed me a piece of paper with an address and a time 7:00 p.m. "Of course, if you'd prefer to involve the authorities, that's your choice. But I should mention that my client has some very interesting documentation about identity fraud, Social Security fraud, tax evasion, things that could make life very complicated for you and Peter." The folder went back into his briefcase with a snap. "I'll see you tomorrow evening, Mrs. Brennan, both of you." After he left Peter, and I sat in stunned silence. I showed him the photographs, explained who Richard was and what his presence meant. "Why can't we just call the police?" Peter asked. "Because he's right about the fraud charges. We've been living under false identities for over a decade. Technically, we've committed multiple federal crimes. So what do? I looked at my son, my brave, damaged, wonderful son who'd never asked for any of this and made a decision that I would regret for the rest of my life. "We go to the meeting, we see what they want, and we figure out how to get out of this." The next evening, we drove to the address Richard had given us. It was indeed a farmhouse, old and isolated, surrounded by fields and woods. There were 2 cars in the driveway, Richard's sedan and an older pickup truck. "I don't like this, Mom," Peter said as we sat in our car looking at the house. "Neither do I, sweetheart. But we'll stay together, and we'll be careful." Richard answered the door, still wearing his business suit, but looking less polished than he had the day before. "Mrs. Brennan, Michael, so glad you could make it. Come in, come in." The farmhouse was sparsely furnished, but clean. We were led into a living room where a fire crackled in the fireplace. Sitting in an armchair facing the door was a man who made my blood freeze. He was older than Jack would have been, probably in his early 50s, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. The same dark hair now streaked with gray, the same build though heavier, and the same green eyes that had once charmed me and later terrified me. But it was the expression in those eyes that made me know we were in terrible danger. This wasn't the charming sociopath Jack had been in the early days. This was pure, concentrated hatred. "So," the man said, his voice rough from cigarettes, "you're the bitch who destroyed my family." The polite pretense was gone. Richard moved to stand behind us, blocking the door. "Let me introduce myself properly. I'm Thomas Brennan, Jack's older brother. And you, Betty, are going to pay for what you did to my little brother." That's when I realized the inheritance story had been a lie. Thomas Brennan hadn't brought us here to give us money. He'd brought us here to kill us. "Your brother tried to murder my son. I protected my child. My brother was a good man driven to desperation by a manipulative wife. You poisoned his son against him, drove him to drink, made him do things he never would have done otherwise." Peter stepped closer to me, his hand finding mine. "That's not true. He tried to drown me when I was a baby." Thomas's face twisted with rage. "Lies, all lies fed to you by this woman. Jack loved you, boy. He died heartbroken because she stole you away from him. He died drunk, crashing his car because he couldn't face what he'd done." I said, my own anger rising despite the fear. Thomas stood up slowly, and I saw something metallic glint in his hand. A gun. Enough talking. Richard, tie them up. We're going to have a long conversation about justice. What followed was the most terrifying night of my life since that bathroom in Detroit. Thomas and Richard bound us to chairs in the farmhouse's kitchen, and Thomas began what he called setting the record straight. He told us about Jack's version of events, how I'd been an unstable, vindictive wife who'd turned his son against him. How Jack had been trying to discipline a defiant child when I'd attacked him with a weapon. How Jack had suffered in prison, writing letters to his brother about the family that had been stolen from him. He never stopped loving you, boy, Thomas said to Peter, who was trying desperately not to show how terrified he was. Even after she poisoned your mind against him, he still wanted you back. I remember what he did to me, Peter said quietly. I remember the water, the cold, not being able to breathe. False memories planted by her. But I could see doubt creeping into Thomas's eyes. Peter's certainty, his visceral fear reaction to even talking about water, was harder to dismiss than he'd expected. Hours passed. Thomas drank steadily from a bottle of whiskey, becoming more volatile and unpredictable. Richard seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but he didn't try to stop his employer. Finally, as dawn was breaking outside the kitchen windows, Thomas made his decision. I can't bring Jack back, but I can make sure you both suffer the way he suffered. You're going to disappear just like you made him disappear from his son's life. He untied me from the chair, but kept the gun pointed at Peter. You're going to walk out into those woods, Betty. You're going to keep walking until I can't see you anymore. And then Richard is going to make sure you never find your way back. And if I refuse, then I shoot the boy right here, right now, while you watch. I looked at Peter, seeing my own desperation reflected in his eyes. We both knew Thomas wasn't bluffing. It's okay, Mom, Peter said softly. Do what he says. I love you, sweetheart, more than life itself. I know, I love you too. Richard pushed me toward the door, the gun now in his hand, while Thomas kept his trained on Peter. We walked into the woods behind the farmhouse, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the trees. After about 15 minutes, when the farmhouse was no longer visible, Richard stopped. This is far enough. He raised the gun, and I closed my eyes, thinking of Peter, praying that somehow he would survive this nightmare. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the quiet forest. But I wasn't dead. Richard was on the ground, blood spreading from a wound in his chest. Standing behind him, holding a large branch like a club, was Peter. Mom, run! Apparently, Thomas had underestimated Peter's determination. Despite his developmental challenges, my son had managed to work free from his restraints and follow us into the woods. But our relief was short-lived. In the distance, we could hear Thomas crashing through the underbrush, shouting our names. Richard, where are you? What was that shot? Peter and I ran deeper into the wood's branches, tearing at our clothes, our breath coming in gasps. Behind us, Thomas's voice grew closer. I'll find you. You can't hide from me forever. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing beside a small stream. Peter was bleeding from scratches on his face and arms, and I wasn't in much better shape. Did I kill him? Peter asked, his voice shaking. I don't know, sweetheart, but you saved my life. What do we do now? Before I could answer, we heard the sound of an engine in the distance. Thomas had gone back for his truck. He was going to hunt us down systematically. We spent the next 6 hours playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek in those woods. Thomas knew the area better than we did, but we were more desperate. Every time we thought we'd lost him, we'd hear the truck engine or his voice calling out to us. Oh, come out wherever you are. You can't run forever. By afternoon, we were exhausted, dehydrated, and running out of places to hide. That's when we heard the most beautiful sound in the world, another voice, a stranger's voice calling out. Hello, is someone out there? I heard gunshots. We emerged from the thicket where we'd been hiding to find an elderly man in hunting gear carrying a rifle. Help us, please, I gasped. There's a man trying to kill us. The hunter, whose name was Earl Patterson, took one look at our torn clothes and terrified faces and believed us immediately. Come on, my truck's just through those trees. We'll get you to the sheriff's office. As we reached Earl's truck, we heard Thomas's voice one last time, much closer than we'd expected. "There you are." He emerged from the trees behind us, his gun raised. But Earl was faster, his hunting rifle already in position. "Drop it, mister, drop it now." For a tense moment, the two men faced each other across the small clearing. Then Thomas smiled the same cold smile I remembered from Jack. "This isn't over, Betty. I'll find you again." He backed into the trees and disappeared. Earl got us to the sheriff's office, where we spent hours giving statements and explaining our situation. The deputies found Richard's body in the woods, where Peter had left him, confirming our story. They searched for Thomas, but found only his abandoned truck. Thomas Brennan had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. Chapter 7. Running Again. The sheriff, a kind man named Bob Morrison, explained our options with the patience of someone who'd dealt with domestic violence cases before. "We'll put out a bolo for Thomas Brennan, and we'll have deputies patrol your neighborhood. But ma'am, I have to be honest, if this man is as determined as you say, and if he's got resources, rural patrols might not be enough." "What are you suggesting?" "That you consider relocating again. I know it's not fair, but sometimes the best protection is distance and anonymity." Peter and I looked at each other across the sheriff's desk. We'd built a life in Seattle, made friends, established careers. The thought of starting over again was exhausting. But the alternative was waiting for Thomas to make good on his threat. "If we go, it has to be different this time," I said. "More complete. He found us once he could find us again." Sheriff Morrison nodded. "There are programs for people in your situation. Federal programs that can provide new identities, relocation assistance. It's usually for witness protection, but given the circumstances." 2 weeks later, Laura and Peter Johnson died in a house fire in Seattle. The bodies were never found because they'd never existed in the first place. Susan and Andrew Miller were born in San Antonio, Texas. This time, the identity change was more thorough, more professional. Federal marshals handled the documentation, created employment history, even provided a house in a middle-class neighborhood where we could blend in with families who minded their own business. But the trauma of our encounter with Thomas had taken its toll, especially on Peter. The son who had been making such progress began to regress. He had nightmares, panic attacks, difficulty concentrating at work. "I keep thinking I see him," Peter told me one evening as we sat in our new living room, still surrounded by boxes we hadn't unpacked. "Every tall man with dark hair, every car that slows down in front of the house." "I know, sweetheart. I feel it too." "When does it end, Mom? When do we get to stop running?" I didn't have an answer for him. The first few months in San Antonio were difficult. Peter struggled with his new job at a local printing company, his skills diminished by stress and fear. I had trouble focusing on my teaching responsibilities, constantly distracted by the need to watch for threats. But gradually, very gradually, we began to heal. The neighborhood we'd been placed in was populated largely by military families, people who understood keeping secrets, who didn't ask too many questions about where you'd come from or why. Our neighbors were friendly, but respectful of privacy. Peter began seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Maria Santos, who specialized in trauma recovery. She helped him develop coping strategies for his anxiety and worked with him on rebuilding the confidence that Thomas had shattered. I threw myself into my work at Roosevelt Elementary teaching 4th grade and volunteering for every committee and after-school program they'd let me join. Staying busy helped keep the fears at bay. Slowly, our new life took shape. By 1995, 2 years after our escape from Thomas, we had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Peter had been promoted to supervisor at the print shop and was taking art classes at the local community college. I had been named Teacher of the Year and was considering pursuing a master's degree in education. We were careful always. We varied our routes, kept our personal information private, paid attention to our surroundings. But we were also living, not just surviving. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was grading papers in my classroom after school when the office secretary knocked on my door. "Mrs. Miller, there's a call for you. The man says it's about your son." My blood turned to ice. Very few people had the number for the school, and fewer still would call about Peter. I picked up the phone with trembling hands. "Hello." "Hello, Betty. Thomas's voice was exactly as I remembered it, cold, controlled, full of hate. I told you this wasn't over. Did you really think you could hide from me forever? What do you want? I want you to suffer the way Jack suffered. I want you to lose everything you love, just like you made him lose everything. Thomas, please. We've built a life here. We're not hurting anyone.
You hurt my brother. You destroyed my family. Now I'm going to destroy yours.
The line went dead. I called Peter immediately, but there was no answer at work or at home. I called the print shop and was told he'd left early saying he felt sick. I drove home at dangerous speeds, running red lights and stop signs, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Peter's car was in our driveway, but the front door was standing open. I found signs of a struggle in the living room, overturned furniture, broken glass. Peter's work bag spilled across the floor. And on the coffee table, weighted down with a beer bottle, was a note in Thomas's handwriting. You have 24 hours to come to the old warehouse on Industrial Avenue. Come alone or your son dies the way you should have died in those woods. TB. I called 911, reported the kidnapping, gave them all the information about Thomas and our history. But I knew that by the time they organized a response, it might be too late. I also knew I couldn't wait for them. That night, I drove to Industrial Avenue and parked outside the warehouse complex Thomas had specified. It was a rundown area on the outskirts of the city, full of abandoned buildings and vacant lots. The warehouse he'd chosen was one of the largest, a massive concrete structure that had once housed aircraft parts during World War II. Now, it was empty, its windows broken, its loading docks sealed with rust. I found an unlocked door on the side of the building and slipped inside. The interior was a maze of empty rooms and corridors, lit only by streetlights filtering through the broken windows. I followed the sound of voices deeper into the building, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found them in what had once been the main production floor, a cavernous space filled with abandoned machinery and shadows. Peter was tied to a chair in the center of the room, his face bruised, but his eyes alert. Thomas stood behind him, one hand resting on Peter's shoulder, the other holding a gun.
Right on time, Betty. I was beginning to think you didn't care about your son.
Let him go, Thomas. Your fight is with me, not with him.
Oh, but that's where you're wrong. This is about family, Betty. Jack's family, the family you destroyed.
Thomas walked around Peter's chair, the gun never wavering. Do you know what it's like to watch your little brother die by inches? To see him broken and bitter and full of hate? Because the woman he loved stole his child and poisoned that child's mind against him.
Jack tried to kill Peter. I was protecting my son.
You were being selfish. You wanted the boy all to yourself, so you made Jack into a monster in his eyes.
Peter spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. He was a monster, I remember.
Thomas backhanded him across the face, and I started forward involuntarily.
Don't move, Betty, or I'll put a bullet in him right now.
I froze, my hands raised.
What do you want from us, Thomas? What will it take to end this?
I want justice. I want you to watch your son die the way Jack wanted to live, to see his son grow up. He pressed the gun against Peter's temple.
Any last words, Betty?
That's when the lights came on, industrial floods that illuminated the entire warehouse like daylight. And with the lights came voices amplified through bullhorns. Federal agents, drop your weapon. The building is surrounded. Thomas spun toward the sound, his gun swinging away from Peter. It was the opening I'd been praying for. I launched myself across the space between us, tackling Thomas around the waist. We went down hard, the gun skittering across the concrete floor. Thomas was stronger than I was, but I was fighting for my son's life. I clawed at his face, kneed him in the stomach, fought with every dirty trick I'd learned from years of surviving his brother's violence. Federal agents poured into the warehouse, shouting commands, their weapons drawn. Thomas and I were still struggling on the floor when they reached us. Let him go. Step away. Strong hands pulled me off Thomas, who was cursing and trying to reach the gun that lay just out of his grasp. They cuffed him while I ran to Peter, my hands shaking as I untied the ropes that bound him to the chair. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? I'm okay, Mom. I'm okay.
We held each other in the middle of that warehouse surrounded by federal agents and flashing lights and cried for everything we'd been through and everything we'd almost lost. But our ordeal wasn't over yet. Thomas Brennan was going to make one final desperate attempt to destroy us, and this time Peter would pay the price. Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. Thomas was arrested and charged with kidnapping, assault, and weapons violations. The federal agents who had been tracking him since the incident in Washington state assured us that he would be held without bail pending trial. "This time he's not getting out," Agent Patricia Lopez told us as we gave our statements. "We have enough evidence to put him away for the rest of his life." Peter and I were taken to the hospital for medical evaluation. He had some bruising and a mild concussion from when Thomas had hit him, but overall he was remarkably uninjured given what he'd been through. I, on the other hand, was a wreck. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was wearing off, leaving me shaky and nauseated. The doctor wanted to keep me overnight for observation. "Mom, I'll stay with you," Peter said as the nurses settled me into a hospital bed. "No, sweetheart. Go home, get some rest. Take a shower, eat something. I'll be fine here." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. The hospital is safe and there are federal agents outside. Thomas is in jail. We're finally safe." How wrong I was. At 3 a.m, I woke to find a figure standing beside my hospital bed. In the dim light from the hallway, I thought it was a nurse at first. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw the face that had haunted my nightmares for years. Thomas Brennan was free, and he was in my hospital room. "Hello, Betty," he said softly. "Miss me?" I tried to scream, but he was faster, his hand clamping over my mouth before I could make a sound. Now, no need to wake the whole hospital. This will just take a minute." He was wearing scrubs and had a hospital ID badge clipped to his shirt. Somehow he'd gotten out of jail and infiltrated the hospital. "You cost me everything, Betty. My brother, my freedom, my life. Now I'm going to cost you everything too." He pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This is insulin, Betty. Enough insulin to put you into a diabetic coma that you'll never wake up from. The perfect murder. No one will suspect anything until it's too late." I struggled against his grip, but I was still weak from the ordeal at the warehouse. He was stronger, and he had the element of surprise. "Don't fight it, Betty. This is justice. This is what you deserve for destroying my family." He raised the syringe, and I closed my eyes, thinking of Peter, hoping he would be able to move on with his life after I was gone. Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Peter's voice in the hallway. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Susan Miller's room. I'm her son." Thomas froze the syringe inches from my arm. "Your son was supposed to be at home," he hissed. The door to my room opened, and Peter walked in carrying a cup of coffee and a magazine. "Mom, I thought you might want some—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Thomas. For a moment, all three of us were frozen in tableau. Thomas holding the syringe, his hand over my mouth. Me wide-eyed with terror. Peter standing in the doorway trying to process what he was seeing. Then Peter moved. He launched himself at Thomas with a fury I'd never seen in my gentle son. The two men crashed into the medical equipment beside my bed, alarms sounding as machines were knocked over. I rolled out of bed and hit the call button, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. "Help security. He's trying to kill us." Thomas and Peter were on the floor fighting for control of the syringe. Thomas was older and heavier, but Peter was desperate and fueled by years of rage at the man who had terrorized his family. "You destroyed our lives," Peter shouted, his fist connecting with Thomas's jaw. "You and your brother destroyed everything!" Security guards poured into the room, followed by police officers and federal agents. It took 4 men to separate Peter and Thomas, both of them bloodied and breathing hard. "How did he get out of jail?" I demanded, as they cuffed Thomas for the second time in 24 hours. Agent Lopez looked grim. "He had help. Someone on the inside. We're investigating, but Mrs. Miller, I'm sorry. Our security failed you." Thomas was dragged away, but not before he turned back to look at us one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cold with hate. "It will never be over." But it was. 3 months later, Thomas Brennan was convicted of federal kidnapping charges, attempted murder, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died of a heart attack in his cell 2 years later alone and unlamented. The nightmare that had begun with Jack Brennan in a Detroit apartment in 1968 was finally over. Chapter 9. Peace at last. After Thomas's conviction, Peter and I made a decision that surprised everyone, including ourselves. We stayed in San Antonio. For 30 years, we'd been running from Jack and his brother. We'd changed our names, our histories, our entire identities to escape their violence. But with Thomas gone, we realized that running had become a habit we no longer needed. Susan and Andrew Miller had become real people with real lives, real friends, real connections to a community. We decided to stay and nurture those connections instead of starting over yet again. Peter, now 30, began to flourish in ways I'd never seen before. The constant fear that had shadowed his life was gone, and with it went many of the limitations I'd thought were permanent results of his childhood trauma. He started dating a woman named Maria Santos, Dr. Santos's daughter, as it turned out. She was a kindergarten teacher with infinite patience and a laugh that could light up a room. She understood Peter's history without being frightened by it, loved him for who he was, rather than despite what he'd been through. They married in 1999 in a small ceremony in our backyard. I walked Peter down the aisle, fighting back tears, as I watched my son promise to love and cherish the woman who had helped him believe in the possibility of happiness. "You did it, Mom," he whispered to me during the reception as we watched Maria dance with her father. "You saved me. You gave me a chance at a real life. We saved each other, sweetheart." 2 years later, Peter and Maria had their first child, a daughter they named Emma. When the doctor placed that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, I felt a completeness I hadn't experienced since Peter was born. "Hello, beautiful girl," I whispered to my granddaughter. "Welcome to our family. You're going to be so loved." Emma was followed by Lucas 3 years later, and suddenly our little family had expanded in the most wonderful way. I was no longer just a mother protecting her damaged child. I was a grandmother watching the next generation grow up safe and happy. The children knew me as Grandma Susan, and they knew their father as Andrew Miller. We never told them about our other names, our other lives. They didn't need to carry the weight of our history. But as they grew older, particularly Emma, who inherited the family talent for asking probing questions, they began to wonder about the parts of our story that didn't quite add up. Grandma, why don't we have any pictures of Daddy when he was little?" Emma asked when she was 8, going through a photo album with me. "We lost them in a fire, sweetheart, a long time ago before you were born." "But why don't we have any family besides us? Don't we have cousins or aunts or uncles?" It was getting harder to explain away the missing pieces of our fabricated history. Peter and I talked about it often, how much to tell them, when to tell them, whether to tell them at all. "They have a right to know where they come from," Peter said one evening as we watched 6-year-old Lucas play with his toy cars. "Not the details, maybe, but the important parts." And if they ask questions, if they want to know more, then we'll figure it out. But Mom, I don't want them to grow up thinking they don't have a history. I don't want them to feel like they came from nowhere." So when Emma turned 10 and Lucas 7, we sat them down for a carefully edited version of our story. We told them that their father had been born with a different name, that we'd had to change our names to stay safe from someone dangerous. We told them that their grandfather had been a bad man who hurt people, and that their father had been very brave when he was little. We told them that families are defined by love, not by names or histories, and that they were part of a family that had chosen to love each other fiercely through everything. "So we're like superheroes?" Lucas asked, his eyes wide. "With secret identities. Something like that," Peter laughed. "But the most important thing is that we're safe now, and we're together." Emma, always the more serious of the two, had a different question. "Are you going to tell us our real name someday? When you're older?" I promised. "When you're ready to understand all of it." The years passed peacefully. I retired from teaching when Emma was 12 and Lucas was 9, spending my time volunteering at their schools and helping Maria with the children. Peter was promoted to manager at the print shop and started his own small graphic design business on the side. We were a normal family living a normal life, and it was more precious to me than any treasure. But in 2018, when Emma was 17 and about to graduate high school, she came to me with a request that I'd been dreading for years. "Grandma, I want to know our real story. All of it." She was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd told her the abbreviated version of our history 7 years earlier. But now, she was nearly an adult preparing for college, ready to face the world on her own. "Are you sure, sweetheart, some of it is very difficult to hear?" "I'm sure. I need to know where I come from. I need to understand why you and Daddy are so strong, why you love each other so fiercely. I need to know what made our family who we are." So I told her everything. I told her about Betty and Michael, about Jack's charm that turned to violence, about the night in the bathroom when I almost lost her father forever. I told her about the years of running the false identities, the constant fear. I told her about Thomas and his relentless pursuit, about the warehouse and the hospital, about the price we'd paid for our safety. Emma listened without interruption, her eyes wide, her hand sometimes reaching out to squeeze mine when the story became particularly difficult. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You were so young when it started," she said finally. "Younger than I am now." I was. Too young to recognize the warning signs, too naive to understand what I was getting into. "But you saved Daddy. You saved yourself. You built this beautiful life for all of us. We survived Emma, that's all. We did what we had to do to survive." "No, Grandma. You did more than survive. You taught Daddy how to love, how to trust, how to be a good father. You showed us what real strength looks like." That night, Emma asked if she could share the story with Lucas, who was now 14, and asking his own questions about our family history. The three of us sat together in the living room, grandmother, granddaughter, and grandson, as Emma carefully told Lucas about our past. He listened with the same wide-eyed attention she had, asking questions, trying to understand the magnitude of what we'd been through. "So our real last name is Brennan?" he asked. "It was. But we chose to leave that name behind. We chose to become Millers, to build something new." "Can we still choose what we want to be called?" "Of course. Names are just words, Lucas. What matters is the people behind them." Both children decided to keep the names they'd grown up with. They were Emma Miller and Lucas Miller, not because that's what their birth certificates said, but because that's who they'd chosen to be. As Emma prepared for college and Lucas entered high school, I found myself thinking more and more about legacy, about what I wanted to leave behind, what I wanted the world to know about our journey. Peter and I were in our 60s now, our hair silver, our faces lined with years of joy and sorrow. We'd survived everything that had been thrown at us, and we'd built something beautiful from the ashes of our trauma. But I realized that our story wasn't just about survival. It was about the power of love to overcome violence, about the strength that ordinary people can find in extraordinary circumstances, about the possibility of healing and hope, even after the worst imaginable pain. Chapter 10, Full Circle. Peter's health began to decline in 2020. The doctors said it was likely related to the brain trauma he'd suffered as a baby. The effects that had seemed so manageable in his youth were catching up with him in middle age. He started having seizures, memory problems, difficulty with coordination. By 2022, he could no longer work and needed help with daily activities. Maria and I took turns caring for him, and the children helped when they could. Emma was finishing her master's degree in social work, inspired by our family's story to help other survivors of domestic violence. Lucas was studying journalism, already talking about wanting to tell important stories about people who don't usually get their voices heard. Despite his declining health, Peter remained optimistic, grateful for the life he'd been able to live. "I got to grow up, Mom," he told me one afternoon as we sat in his backyard, watching Emma and Lucas play with their cousins, Maria's sister's children, who had accepted our family without question. "I got to fall in love, get married, have children. I got to be happy. That's more than a lot of people get. You deserved all of that and more, sweetheart." "We both did. And Mom, I want you to tell our story. All of it. After I'm gone, I want you to tell the world what happened to us." "Peter, I'm serious. There are other women out there like you, were other children like I was. They need to know that survival is possible, that there's life after trauma. He died peacefully in his sleep on January 15th, 2024, exactly 57 years after he was born. Maria was with him holding his hand, whispering about how much he was loved. The funeral was small but beautiful. We buried him as Andrew Miller, but I knew that Michael Brennan was finally at peace too. At the service, Emma read a poem she'd written about resilience, about the strength that gets passed down through generations. Lucas spoke about his father's gentleness, his capacity for joy despite everything he'd endured. And I made a promise at my son's graveside, a promise to honor his final request. So here I am, 6 months later, finally ready to tell our story. All of it. I'm 78 years old now, living in the same house in San Antonio where Peter and I built our last and best life. Emma visits often with her new husband, a kind man who understands that our family has been through something extraordinary. Lucas just graduated college and is working for the local newspaper writing stories about social justice and community resilience. They still call me Grandma Susan because that's who I've been to them. But they know about Betty Brennan too, and they understand that both women are part of who I am. Some people might wonder why I'm telling this story now, when it's finally safe to let the past stay in the past. But Peter was right. There are other women out there, other children, other families trapped in cycles of violence and afraid they'll never escape. I want them to know that escape is possible. It's hard, it's scary, it might require sacrifices you never imagined making. But it's possible. I want them to know that love is stronger than violence, that healing is possible, even after the worst trauma, that children are more resilient than we sometimes give them credit for. I want them to know that sometimes, from the deepest pain, comes the most profound strength. Most of all, I want them to know that they are not alone. If you are reading this and you see yourself in any part of our story, if you're afraid, if you're trapped, if you think there's no way out, please know that there is hope. There are people who will help you. There is life after abuse, love after trauma, peace after chaos. It took me 56 years to feel safe enough to tell this story publicly. I hope that by sharing it, I can help shorten that timeline for someone else. My name is Betty Margaret O'Connor Brennan Johnson Miller. I've been many women in my lifetime, but they all had one thing in common: they never gave up. I survived. My son survived. My grandchildren are thriving. And if we can do it, so can you. The little girl who learned to sew by lamplight in Detroit never imagined she'd live to be a grandmother telling stories to the world. The young mother who fought for her son's life in a cold bathroom never dreamed she'd see him grow up to have children of his own. But here I am. Here we are. Still standing. Still fighting. Still believing in the possibility of tomorrow. That's the real inheritance I want to leave my grandchildren, not money or property, but the knowledge that no matter what life throws at them, they come from a long line of survivors. They come from people who chose love over fear, hope over despair, life over death. And that, my dear readers, is a legacy worth fighting for.